Today we're going to talk about Chapter 11, Abnormal Psychology. Now, in terms of the background of abnormal psychology, psychopathology refers to the overall study of psychological and mental disorders. Okay, the big thing is, mental disorders are characterized by several words, several adjectives that describe it. One, it's deviant. It's deviant to society, it's deviant to other people. Maladaptive, or harmful behaviors, means they're a harm to themselves or they're a harm to other people. Now, disruptive patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting can cause distress and dysfunction. The main thing you have to kind of remember with this is people that experience mental disorders are not only a harm to themselves, but in the most part, they bother other people that have trouble kind of being around these people because of some of the characteristics that they show. Now, in terms of deviant behavior, it's defined as being different from the behavior of most people in a particular culture. The problem with using deviant behavior as an indication of abnormal psychology is cultures often differ in behavior. For example, some people who excel or work out past the norm may be seen as deviant. So for some people that are obsessed, if they use that word, with working out, someone who works out 4 or 5 hours a day compared to somebody who works out 1 hour a day, some people might look at that person as being odd or being obsessive. Okay? In terms of infrequency, behaviors are seen infrequently or considered abnormal, but people who do not follow the crowd would be seen as abnormal. So in other words, people that have a tendency to stand out or not follow what other people do will often be considered odd by other people. So that's not always the best way to look at it either. Personal suffering could be another indication, but some have cognitive impairments and do not know they're suffering. So somebody that's mentally challenged might not know that the harm they're causing themselves in terms of hygiene may not be understood by most people. The practical approach focuses on how a person's thoughts, feelings, or behavior interfere with the daily functioning. This is the best approach. Okay? In other words, when something is considered abnormal psychology is, for example, when somebody cannot perform regular or daily routines. In other words, they can't go to work, they can't take care of their family, they can't take care of themselves. Now, in terms of where the origins of psychological disorders began, in the 1800s, Philip Pinel of France was one of the first to determine that mental illness was not the result of demonic possession. Up to this, religion basically hovered over mental illness, and anybody that was considered mentally ill was considered to be possessed. And they used a lot of barbaric tactics in the past to try to figure this out. In other words, they believed people encompassed the spirit, and they would try to release the spirit. And some of the things they did obviously never cured the person, but hurt the person. Now, his work led to the medical model, which the medical model is the background for psychological disorders. That people actually have sicknesses that are associated with specific symptoms. For example, Pinel's work in terms of syphilis. If syphilis was left untreated, it would cause madness. So what that demonstrated was simply that there's more than demonic possession to somebody who's mentally ill. Now, on the next screen, okay, etiology refers to the process of investigating possible causes and developmental factors that may contribute to the onset of psychological disorders. Etiology is a growing field where people are constantly looking for a common link between people who experience several different types of disorders. And they often will encompass these 4 types of models. Neurobiological model, which is the formal name for medical model, looks at the result of biological factors, such as brain or genetics, which is prevalent in certain types of disorders. Psychological disorder looks at the result of disorders being from psychological process, how people interpret stress, traumatic events that they might have been a part of, and how that's affected them long term. Social cultural model will look at societal roles and expectations, living location, gender, ethnicity, cultural backgrounds, in terms of their contributors to psychological disorder. Basically, to summarize all 3, is the biopsychosocial model. And these are disorders that are a combination of biological, psychological, and social factors. The main thing is, all 3 of these will contribute to a disorder, okay? It just depends on which one they basically emphasize. Now, on the next page, this would be a typical question you would get. According to the biopsychosocial model, genetic predispositions would be an example of which factor. So which one of these would genetics, fall under? Most of you would probably say that would fall under letter C, neurobiological model, which is the correct answer. Okay? Now, the diathesis stress model is probably one of the most common models that's used by psychologists and psychiatrists. This basically model is useful in identifying factors that can contribute to a disorder. And what this basically says is diathesis is a genetic component, and that stress basically leashes or unleashes or releases that genetic component. So in other words, if two people have a genetic predisposition, which again is diathesis, to a disorder, the one with more stress has a higher chance of developing this disorder. And they've done studies on this. Schizophrenia, which is primarily a genetic disorder, two siblings have had, obviously two parents with schizophrenia. One sibling developed schizophrenia basically because of the stressful life that they had. Now, here's a typical question that could be from that. Jimmy and Rich are identical twins who share a genetic predisposition for major depression. Jimmy lives in a fast-paced lifestyle that involves a challenging career, travel, and not much time for rest and relaxation. Rich, on the other hand, lives a more relaxed life and enjoys a simple lifestyle. When they turned 35, Jimmy started to show symptoms of major depression. Now, which approach would simply account for this? Most of you looking at this would say B, diathesis stress model. Again, diathesis, genetic, and stress is the component that could contribute or simply release that genetic predisposition. Now, classifying psychological disorders. In order for psychologists to study disorders, basically they must have a common way to classify and organize them. Studying people with similar symptoms allows psychologists to compare family histories, thinking, and behavior. This is key, because if you're going to study a disorder, you have to look for commonalities between people who develop this disorder. Whether that's genetic, whether that's where they live, whether that's psychological in terms of the way they think. Now, in 1952, the APA, or American Psychological Association, published a reference book that's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. Now, it's used by all psychologists, and what this allows is, if you get a diagnosis from one psychologist down the street and then go to another psychologist further down the street, you will have the same diagnosis. This rules out assumptions and opinions because they're following a strict guideline in terms of diagnosing, okay? Because everybody's going to see somebody differently in terms of the disorder they have. Now, the 5th edition is set to be released in year 2013, which is this year. And the DSM-5, okay, which is, simply more of an extension of the original DSM from 1952. Now, on this next page, okay, breaking down the DSM-4, which is the TR, which is the edition right before the 5th, Access 1 always includes clinical syndromes. And these clinical syndromes include anxiety disorders, substance abuse disorders, eating disorders, sleep disorders, mood disorders, just to a few. All your major disorders are under Access 1. Access 2, which you will get a question on eventually, just encompasses personality disorder, as well as mental challenges. Now, the reason why personality disorders are on Access 2 and not Access 1 is primarily this. Personality disorders tend to be lifelong, whereas clinical disorders such as anxiety, substance abuse, or eating disorders are more tied to a specific time frame. Okay, so again, personality disorders last a person's life. Now, Access 3 looks at general medical conditions such as ulcers, diabetes, other physical symptoms. Access 4 looks at psychosocial or environmental problems. In other words, poverty, crime, where somebody grows up. This also takes into consideration cultural expectations and problems. Access 5 is a global assessment. It's a scale basically on the current ability of how a person's able to function. 91 through 100, if they scored that, would have no problems. However, 51 to 60, they would have some difficult functioning, and 1 to 10, inability to function, which probably would end up that they would have to be hospitalized. Okay? Most people would score with some difficulty, and if they are hospitalized, they would be in the bracket of 1 to 10. Now, difficult question, substance abuse disorders would be listed on which axis? Okay? Now remember, personality disorders and mental challenges would be on Access 2. So the answer for this would be Access 1. Now another question, mental retardation or challenges would be listed on which axis? Again, that's a lifelong condition. Access 2 is a lifelong condition. That would be Access 2. Now, labeling psychological disorders is kind of a tough thing to do. Critics often believe that when you label somebody, when you put a label on somebody, they have the expectation to live up to that label. So when you classify somebody as major depressed, even if they are not major depressed, they will feel they have to live up to that label. So in other words, labels can also have drawbacks. As Thomas Zaz pointed out, that a label is not the same as a description. A description would include more details to why somebody is majorly depressed, other than just simply putting a label on a prescription bottle. Now, on the next page, okay, which this chapter is broken down into types of disorders. Anxiety disorders. Anxiety is basically what you think it is. It's apprehension, it's worrying, it's increased physical arousal, and over time, anxiety basically starts to dissipate. However, an anxiety disorder is characterized by extreme feelings of apprehension, which is worrying, which disrupt functioning and are present for a long time. The difference between everyday anxiety and an anxiety disorder is often this, and that is that it's persistent and it's often unexplainable. Okay? Somebody that has anxiety about having to give a presentation in third hour, that would be considered normal anxiety. Somebody who has an anxiety disorder doesn't understand why their hands begin to shake, in the middle of class, or while they're driving home, or while they're trying to sleep. Now, even when there is no threat, anxiety is still present, and that's often a big key in terms of diagnosing anxiety disorders. They have no reason to show anxiety. Now, this chart right here basically outlines the major types of anxiety disorders. Phobias, and the key word with a phobia is an irrational fear of an object. When I say irrational fear, irrational means there should be no reason why they have anxiety, or they simply are afraid of whatever it is. Now, some examples of phobias. Specific phobias involve a particular fear. Avoidance of animals, heights, acrophobia is one of the most common. Social phobia would be irrational fear related to social situations. This one is a little bit more harmful, because agoraphobia is an irrational fear of open places. And what that means is people with agoraphobia don't leave their home. Now, is it possible in today's society to never leave your home? Actually, with the internet it is. Okay? And there are some cases of agoraphobia where neighbors never even know somebody is living there because they never leave their house. They never go outside. Everything is done inside. Now, generalized anxiety disorder is mild anxiety not connected to any particular object or situation. The way to remember this is, generally speaking, they have anxiety from morning to night. But it's mild enough where it doesn't cause that much harm, but there's enough of it that it basically disrupts certain types of functioning, like social relationships, or holding a job, or raising a family. This is also referred to as free-floating anxiety. Now, panic disorder, okay, is a sudden occurrence of a panic attack. Rapid heart rate, heavy breathing, dizziness, and fainting. This is different than a panic attack. Panic attacks are usually tied to a specific stimuli. For example, you get a panic attack when you get bad news, or you get a panic attack when you get a bad grade on a test. Panic disorder, what makes this different is they're unpredictable. People that have panic disorder, they could occur at any single point of the day, and there's no rhyme or reason to them. Sometimes they'll have 3 or 4 panic attacks a day. Sometimes they may have several in a week. The difference is, often what this leads to is agoraphobia. Why people have a tendency not to leave their home is the fear of having a panic attack in public. All right? It gets to the point that even trying to leave the house causes anxiety, and they often will not leave the house and remain inside. Now, OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. First of all, you have to know obsessions are repetitive thoughts. Compulsions are repetitive actions. Now, the connection between these two is often when people get a repetitive thought, like they have germs on their hands, or they simply have come in contact with some major virus, is a compulsive action, such as hand washing, which is ritualistic. Often what that will do is simply hide the obsessive thought, because all their energy goes into the compulsive act. Now, there's always the saying that everyone's a little bit of obsessive compulsive. And the main thing that I want to make sure that you guys understand is that obsessive compulsive disorder is a daily type of problem. Okay? We all recheck things once in a while. That's usually tied to the stress of our day. But OCD often will interfere and disrupt someone's functioning where they might not even leave home because they cannot get over the obsessive thought that their door is unlocked. Okay? And that's, again, the practical approach to abnormal psych always comes down to this. Okay, is that it disrupts daily functioning. Some of you, still come to class, but you have the thought that you left, your light on, but it doesn't, interfere enough where you have to go back home and disrupt your day. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is one of the most, probably one of the most investigated anxiety disorders, because PTSD has been related to traumatic experiences. And being that a lot of people are returning from the Iraq War, they have seen more and more cases of PTSD. Now I can tell you the APA has taken this under advisement, and they're offering more services that people, when they get off the plane and they come back to America, more so than when people came home from Vietnam. Vietnam PTSD wasn't as common. It was basically discovered after people had returned home. So now, they have, simply treatment set up before it ever surfaces. And the main thing with PTSD is this, is that they have a hard time separating the past from the present. In other words, when you are daydreaming in my class, you are still aware that you're in this classroom. People with PTSD often cannot separate the past from the present. The past becomes real. Now, there's a lot of investigation on this, but usually what there is some type of trigger point that simply triggers the past memory. Okay? And a lot of times with people that came home from Vietnam, where they would struggle with is when they heard loud noises outside. What that would do is often trigger a memory from the war. And when they would come out, they no longer saw their subdivision. They saw basically their past memory of wherever this memory occurred. Now, typical couple questions, because you're going to get these on your test. A phobia is best defined as how? Now, when you look at phobia, you're always going to look at irrational fear. Why is it irrational? Because you shouldn't be afraid of it. People that have phobias of carpeting, most people would say, well, why are you afraid of carpeting? Exactly. That's why it's called a phobia. Now, another question you would see from the anxiety disorders, Sally says she experiences anxiety throughout the day. She has no idea why, and lately has become more persistent. Sally most likely would be diagnosed with, and again, she has it throughout the day. So generally speaking, she shows anxiety throughout the day, so most of you would say the answer was D. Now, causes of anxiety disorder, biopsychosocial approach, which again, that takes into effect the biological, psychological, and social factors. Biologically, anxiety disorders can run in the family. They can be genetically passed down from one person to the next. Now, example of that, a twin has a higher chance if the other twin develops, an anxiety disorder. Now, some people inherit a predisposition, okay, that causes the autonomic nervous system to overreact to stressful stimuli. Autonomic nervous system, if you remember from chapter 2, is automatic, okay? And what happens is their autonomic nervous system is more active or more aroused very easily than most of ours. Now, some people also have predispositions, which again, that's genetic, to inherit certain neurotransmitters that may link to anxiety disorders. And this is a good review of chapter 2. Norepinephrine, which is linked with arousal, tends to be overactive in people with anxiety disorders. It kind of makes sense. Serotonin, which is a mood regulator, it regulates your moods. Okay, it's involved in sleep and mood, shows a lack of. So in other words, the one neurotransmitter that's supposed to keep their neurotransmitters balanced is not simply, insufficient. GABA, which slows down brain activity and tends to be in lesser amounts with people with anxiety disorders. So again, norepinephrine, which naturally arouses your body, they have more of. Serotonin, which keeps you simply stable, in other words, at a level in terms of your emotions are not too high or too low, that seems to be a lack of. And then GABA, which naturally slows your brain activity down, basically they tend to have lesser amounts of that. Now, psychological factors, observational learning. Some people can learn, anxiety disorders. For example, if parents model certain types of anxiety, if they simply get stressed out very easily, they often model this for their children. Lack of perceived control, This was one in personality that you guys learned. Internal locus of control, they feel they have control over their environment and their situations. People that have anxiety problems often have an external locus of control. They feel that everything else is controlling them, all except themselves. Now, John B. Watson and Rosaire Rainier, when we talked about that in the learning chapter, demonstrated that emotions could be conditions, as with the example of little Albert. Now, look at this example, and this is a good example of classical conditioning. People in a car accident may associate driving with fear. In other words, driving was a neutral stimulus. But because they associated it with simply the accident, and the accident obviously caused a lot of distress, now they won't ever drive again. And that does sometimes happen with people. Now, the next type of disorder deals with somatoform disorders. This occurs when people experience psychological problems associated with physical symptoms, which there is no physical origin. Now, this right here, several movies make reference to this. Conversion disorder is sensory and motor failure, blindness, deafness, or paralyzed limbs with no identifiable physical cause. Now, this usually first appears in childhood or adolescence under extreme stress. This one's tough to understand, but literally somebody can have such a traumatic experience that they go blind, or they go deaf, or they lose the ability to walk. Okay, this has happened with a few people, and one example I'll bring up in class happened with somebody that was involved in a very serious car accident and ended up, killing somebody. Hypochondriac, which is probably one you guys are familiar with, they have no physical illness, but they are 100% convinced they do. Okay? These people, hypochondriacs, are in the doctor's office every single day, often diagnosing themselves. And what will often happen is they will eventually find a doctor. If one doctor says, no, you don't have anything, they'll go to another doctor. Okay? Now, somatization disorder is people have multiple physical ailments rather than an isolated disease or condition. This generally occurs in women and may coincide with depression or anxiety disorders. The difference between this and conversion disorder is isolated to one type of disease or disorder. Somatization is they just simply from head to toe feel that there's something wrong. Now, pain disorder is they report severe pain without any physical cause. Okay? Now, causes of somatoform disorders. Early in life, children may learn that special attention and privileges are granted when they are sick. This rationalization may carry over to adulthood. So when mom and dad overdid it, in other words, gave them enormous amounts of attention when they were sick, they may feel in adulthood when they're not getting enough attention, if they act sick, then people will listen to them or people will react to them better or give them more attention. Now, diathesis stress model. Again, diathesis, genetic, stress is the environment, indicates that somatoform disorders are the result of people being overly sensitive to physical sensations of aches and pains. So in other words, I don't like to use this word, they kind of get babied. And when they get babied, they feel that, the slightest little thing is a major deal. Now, this right here, dissociative disorders, is probably the most complex one. Dissociative disorders are very rare. This is your multiple personality disorders. This is, dissociative amnesia or dissociative fatigue. Now, the main thing that you have to remember with dissociative disorders is that it disrupts memory. Okay? So starting with the one on the bottom, somebody that has dissociative identity disorder, okay, formerly called multiple personality. This is the main thing you have to remember, is the person has one or more personalities that are so distinct from each other. But the main thing is, they are, when I say distinct, there is no memory of each other. So somebody that has multiple personality disorder could be a teacher by day and be a bartender by night. The thing is, each personality is unaware of the other. Now, dissociative amnesia is more specific to a memory. A person that might not have a memory of a specific event, like for example childhood, or their early 20s. In other words, dissociative amnesia, there is something within their personality, something in their past that is totally blocked out, that they have no idea how to recall. It's not they can't remember, it's that there's nothing there to remember. Now, dissociative fatigue is probably the most talked about and probably the most rare. Is that a person basically wakes up one day, has no idea who they are, no idea why they're in this room, no idea why they're in this house, and often will travel somewhere, that means to flee, and start a whole new life. Now, probably the most known case was a father of several who lived in New York, woke up one day, had no idea who he was, who this family was, got in his car, took off, and started a whole new life in Miami. Ended up living in Miami 6-7 years, started a whole new life, okay? Again, made friends, got married, then woke up one day down there, had no idea why he was there, drove back to New York. And the thing, he was gone for several years, came back to New York like he had just stepped out, to get something off the front lawn. Had no idea he was gone 6 or 7 years, no idea why he looked so much older. And again, his family had given up on him in New York and basically said, where have you been? He had no idea. No idea. And so finally they were able to connect the pieces where he was from simply, driver's license and some of the past bills, and realized the guy was living two lives. The problem was each life was not aware of each other. Okay? Now, typical question. Luke experienced a sudden loss of memory that resulted in his forming a new identity. Traveling, and here's the key point, traveling to a new location. Now, if he traveled to a new location, that's basically he fled, and dissociative fatigue means to flee. Okay, so the answer was C for that one. Now, causes of dissociative disorders. Researchers suggest that some people experience memory and identity loss as the result of a traumatic event the person did not want to cope with. In other words, they could not resolve, and instead of resolving it, they simply blocked it out or eliminated it from their consciousness. Psychodynamic perspective, and this is Freud, believed that dissociative disorders develop as a result of repression. In other words, repression is the automatic exclusion or blocks simply any type of event from coming into consciousness. Now, it pushes it down into the unconscious, and that's where Freud believed that the second identity or second multiple personality is basically residing. And again, the unconscious a person is unaware of, so they have no idea that this other person exists. Okay. Social cognitive therapists believe that people act differently in different situations. And somebody that's experiencing dissociative identity disorder, it's extreme. So in other words, some people act a little bit more crazy when they go out at night. For these people, they take it to a whole different level and a whole different personality. Now, mood disorders are some of the most common. Major depression, okay, which is under mood disorders, is also known as affective disorders. And this involves extreme mood disruptions such as depression and mania. People experience mood disruptions, but mood disorders are not consistent with situation or circumstantial factors. So in other words, it's considered, if somebody passed away in your life, that you would be obviously depressed, but it's consistent with the situation of somebody dying. Now, unipolar are people experiencing emotional disturbances specific to one emotion or mood. This is depression. Bipolar, people experience problems at the opposite sides of the spectrum. In other words, one side is excitement and one side is depression. Now, depression can range from a number of things. To manageable sadness, you're still able to work, to extreme episodes of depression that require hospitalization due to harm of the body. Now, types of depressive disorders. Major depressive disorders, also referred to as unipolar disorder. Now, when you look at some of the characteristics, this is depression severe. Okay? This will often last, and this is the key, people. This will often last for a couple weeks. If somebody is depressed one day, even if they're showing severe depression one day and it goes away, that's not considered major depression. If it's day in and day out for a period of 2 weeks, then there's probably some type of help that's going to be needed. Now, they can have changes in activity level, which I often have learned from my studies in psychology, that if you don't enjoy doing things that you once enjoyed, that's often a sign that there could be something wrong. So for some of you, going out shopping makes you feel better. But if that no longer brings happiness to your life, then obviously there could be a little bit more to it than just simply you don't feel good. Now, there's also hygiene problems, rapid weight loss, cognitive problems. You can't focus, remember, thinking is disrupted. Person feels worthless or hopeless or inadequate. Suicidal ideations or thoughts start to flourish. People start to talk about it a little bit more in terms of themselves in past tense. Now, dysthymic disorder is less intense depression and offer of longer duration than major depression. Major depression is it comes on very strong, and it's very disruptive, and it's very, very harmful to the person. Dysthymic could be years. Dysthymic, they're still able to work, they're still able to manage, their family. But the problem is most people would characterize them as something is wrong. Okay? Now, dysthymic disorder is characterized by, now when you look for dysthymic as an answer, you're looking for less severe symptoms when it's compared to major depression. So when you look all the way down here, the mild depression would be the one that kind of basically sets out or steps out. It's also persistent for more than 2 years. Major depression, often after a couple weeks, people will know and often will have to seek hospitalization. Now, bipolar disorder. Remember, bipolar is basically polar opposite of depression is mania. This is characterized by extreme enthusiasm, optimistic outlook, and energetic state of mind. This is basically more than just being excited. This is extreme excitement. Now, bipolar 1, which was basically called manic depressive disorder, is you're alternating between periods of deep depression, so in other words, major depression, and then you're simply all of a sudden switching moods. In other words, North Pole, South Pole, that's why it's called bipolar, to extreme optimism, extreme energy. Now, this could last for a day, this could last for a week, but often what happens is it's a rapid switch between one pole and the next. So you go from major depression to signs of mania pretty much within a day. Now, bipolar is rare. All right, it's talked about, but it is rare. It only affects about 1% of the country. Bipolar II disorder is a little bit different. The major depressive episodes alternate with periods of hypomania. Hypomania is less severe cases of mania, okay, when compared to bipolar I. Hypomania would be more your extreme excitement, but in a controlled fashion, okay? Whereas bipolar I, you would notice a manic or a mania type of episode. Now, cyclothymic is very comparable to disthymic disorder. It's a milder form of bipolar. So it's milder, forms of depression and milder forms of mania. Now, often, again, it still is going to alternate. So they're going to have one extreme and then simply back it down with, a period of depression. Now, typical question, one difference between bipolar I and bipolar II. Remember, bipolar II has a less severe case of mania. And so that would simply be hypomania. So you would look for an example of hypomania, and you would see less severe periods of mania. Now, causes of mood disorders. Okay? Mood disorders can run in families. They can be genetic. Okay? One thing they found is a malfunction on chromosome 13, which is connected to the production of the neurotransmitter serotonin. Serotonin, remember, is a mood stabilizer. So people that have a mood disorder obviously have a lack of serotonin. Now, they also have problems with the endocrine system. They have excessive release of the stress hormone cortisol. Now, cortisol is connected with corticosteroids. So what happens is it's affected by their hypothalamus. This often can lead to weight gain as well as obviously signs of depression. They also have a lack of development of the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are in charge of thinking. Their hippocampus tends to be smaller, so their memory tends to be a little bit more restricted. And the amygdala, which is in charge of emotions, also in the limbic system, also has problems or lack of functioning. The other thing is, mood disorders are connected with a lack of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter involved with pleasure. Norepinephrine with alertness, so obviously they don't have as much in terms of excitement, so often people with major depression have a lack of norepinephrine, and people with bipolar have too much norepinephrine. And then we talked about serotonin. Now, a problem with chromosome, which one, seems to be connected with the production of serotonin. Now, this probably will never be a question on the national exam, but just for memorization purposes, that's 13, which obviously is connected with the production of serotonin. Now, causes of mood disorders, seasonal affective disorder, okay, which is connected under the mood disorder, is connected with the changing of seasons. More people become depressed in the winter months, partly because there's a lack of sunlight, but also their circadian clock or suprachiasmatic nucleus may release too much melatonin. Okay? Now, negative thinking, pessimistic outlook, women tend to have a higher chance of developing a mood disorder. Social cognitive therapists suggest learned helplessness leads to depression, which then that was Martin Seligman. Learned helplessness is when you fail several times, you have a tendency to give up more often. And then obviously social factors of poverty, crime, and environmental factors can also lead to this. Now, schizophrenia is probably one of the most talked about and studied disorders. This is a psychotic disorder, and it often has debilitating disorder that involves patterns of disturbed thinking, or it's often referred to as a split brain. And when I say split brain, this is not to be confused with multiple personality disorder. Split brain refers to the difference between rational and psychotic. They cannot tell the difference between what is fantasy and what is real. Now, schizophrenia affects about 1 to 2% of the population and tends to develop in late teen years. Diathesis stress model would say that schizophrenia, even if you're born with a genetic predisposition, often will surface in very stressful situations. And unfortunately, late adolescence going into college can sometimes trigger this. Now, substance abuse problems, especially cocaine. Cocaine causes the release of dopamine. Too much dopamine, eventually leads to hallucinations. Okay? Now, typical question, split mind is used to describe schizophrenia. Refers to anxiety arousing, multiple personality, and what you would look for is basically disorganized thinking patterns. They cannot tell the difference between fiction and reality. Now, this table right here has some of the symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Neologisms are using words that only have meaning to the person saying them. So I have an example out there, scalp truss. All right, and most of you will, hopefully none of you use that word. But for the most part, nobody knows what it means. Okay? claim associations, they often talk in double meanings. Okay? They will use rhymes. The snake did not break at a high rate. And often when they're talking, it feels like there's a claim to it. There's like a rhythm or some type of, association. Loose associations, one thought doesn't seem to be connected with another. The car sat down and went to sleep. Most people would look at that and say, well, what does that mean? To a schizophrenic, that has meaning. But obviously, because they have a split mind, they cannot separate between reality and fictional types of thinking. Now, word salad is repetitions of non-meaningful statements. They will simply often repeat words or repeat sayings over and over that have no meaning. Okay, so it's literally like a jumble of words. There's no rhyme or reason to what they're saying. John grew the house, the bird flew upside down, the heart it flips. It has no meaning to anybody that's listening to them. Now, two of the more common ones, delusions, are false and distorted beliefs. Delusional thinking is a false belief. Now, delusions of influence, and there's several of them. Delusions of influence believe that one is being controlled by outside forces, that they're simply being followed, that someone's bugging their phone line, that someone's listening in their brain, that somebody's tapped, their life, and they injected them with a poison that records all their information. Delusions of grandeur is exaggerated beliefs about oneself. Usually it's God. You will sometimes see people believing that they're a prophet, that they're the coming of Christ, that they're here to save everybody, or they're an alien of some sort. And that's delusions of grandeur. Delusions of persecution, the belief that others are out to get them. This is one of the more common ones. And this is why schizophrenia sometimes can be dangerous. Because they will do whatever they can to defend themselves, especially if they have the belief that other people are causing harm to them. You have to remember one thing with schizophrenia. They often cannot distinguish between fiction and reality. So with you coming at them, they do not see just a person. They may see an image, they may see a past memory, but they could often lash out. Now, hallucinations, which are false reports of sensory perceptions. Auditory hallucinations are the most common. They hear voices. Okay? Hallucinations may also include visual, they see things that are not there, smelling, tactile, or feeling. Okay? Now, inappropriate emotions. Often their emotions don't align to the situation. Typical example is they may laugh at a funeral because they don't understand the proper emotion that should be displayed at a funeral. Their emotions, amygdala especially, doesn't line up properly. Now, flat affect is simply they don't display any emotional response to stimuli. They get told that someone passed away, they show a flat affect. They show no emotion. Okay? Now, a couple of questions that could come from this. James believes that he is God and that he therefore has tremendous powers. What type of delusion would that be? Again, that's a false belief. Now, grandeur, how you remember that is they believe they're grand. Okay, and so that would line up with that example that deals with thinking that you're God. Now, this is kind of important to understand because you always get a question on this. There's positive and negative symptoms associated with schizophrenia. And this again goes back to our learning chapter. This does not refer to emotion. This refers to the addition of or the subtraction of. So in other words, positive symptoms include disorganized thoughts, hallucinations, and delusions. Again, the addition of these symptoms makes them schizophrenic. Okay? Negative symptoms include what they're missing, all right, what they lack. So in other words, they lack pleasure, motivation, speech skills, and the expression of emotion. Okay? Again, what they are missing makes them schizophrenic. Now, in this table right here are the more common types of schizophrenia. Now you can see by the table, 40% of all schizophrenics tend to be paranoid. Paranoid schizophrenics, again, it first appears around early 20s. And this is simply delusions of grandeur or persecution. In other words, they believe everyone's out to get them. And the onset is very sudden with this type of schizophrenia. It comes on sometimes within days, okay, where they were simply normal in terms of their cognition and then full-blown schizophrenia, within a week. Now, disorganized schizophrenia, many homeless people are affected by this. And again, this is about 5%. Now, delusions, hallucinations tend to be the symptom, disorganized thinking and speech. Neglected hygiene often does stand out, okay? So a lot of times people do not understand if somebody is homeless or if somebody is mentally sick with schizophrenia. That's why a lot of times you have to kind of be careful with approaching homeless people. Catatonic schizophrenia is kind of a mystery one. They have odd movements and immobility, which is called a stupor, and unexpected body movement. This is called waxy flexibility. They could literally sit in a rigid position with an arm extended like this for hours, not moving. Okay? And often when you see a catatonic schizophrenia, you can go up right in front of them, there would not even be a blink of their eyes. Now, again, this affects about 8% of all schizophrenics, so it is not as common as paranoid. Undifferentiated, they don't fall into any category, okay? And that's about, again, 40%. They can't be classified because they show so many different symptoms. There's no rhyme or reason. Schizophrenia is hard to diagnose because a lot of symptoms are not seen, on a daily basis. Residual schizophrenia is people who once had schizophrenic symptoms but are not presently experiencing or displaying symptoms. Frequency varies on this one, but they can control schizophrenia with medication, okay? And we'll kind of go over a couple factors how they do that in the next chapter. A type of schizophrenia that is characterized by total immobility, waxy flexibility, in other words, they don't move for long periods of time. Most of you would say, well, that sounds catatonic. And why it's called catatonic, by the way, is because cats freeze when there's danger. They don't move, okay? And so when schizophrenics of catatonia feel that they are threatened by some sort, they go into this rigid, defensive position. Now, research has shown that schizophrenia runs in families. Now, when you look at this stat, if one twin develops schizophrenia, the other identical twin has a 40% chance. It's not 100%, but obviously it's enough where you have to watch for certain things. Some of the other, symptoms that are associated, or causes, I should say, associated with schizophrenia: undersized prefrontal cortex and thalamus. The brain sensory relay center. The thalamus doesn't relay the sensory information to the right areas of the brain. Remember, the thalamus is your relay center. Increased size in ventricles. There seems to be like gaps in their brain, like holes, so to speak. They almost look like craters on the moon. Now, they also have excessive, and this is probably the most known, they have excessive receptor sites for dopamine. Dopamine has been linked with basically hallucinations, the positive symptom of hallucination. In other words, somebody who takes a lot of cocaine will have what's called induced psychosis. They will actually cause schizophrenia within their brain. Okay? Now, excessive receptors of the neurotransmitter blank have been linked to the development of schizophrenia. Most of you would pretty much pick up right away that was dopamine, letter C. Now, other causes of schizophrenia, which are not as common as the ones on the previous page: prenatal viruses, influenza, or the flu. If a mother was extremely sick during pregnancy, that could lead to schizophrenia. Parental age. If a father is over 45, they run a higher chance. Now again, this is correlational. Correlational means there's a relationship. It doesn't exactly mean cause and effect. Then you have, obviously, dysfunctional or highly critical families. Environmental stress can also play a role. Vulnerability theory of schizophrenia is very similar to diathesis stress model. And it basically says if you carry a genetic link for schizophrenia, then the amount of stress that you encounter in a day increases the vulnerability that you can simply, have it develop. All right, the last type of disorder we have to talk about is personality disorders. Now remember, personality disorders are on Axis 2 of the DSM. Personality disorders tend to be lifelong, whereas people that have major depression, dissociative, schizophrenia, or anxiety, they tend to be tied to a specific time of their life. Now, these disorders tend to start in childhood and continue to, develop into adulthood. The most striking distance, like I said, is Axis 2. Now, personality disorders are grouped into 3 categories. Cluster A is odd, eccentric, cluster B is dramatic, erratic, and cluster C is anxious, fearful. Now, for the most part, you don't have to know them all, but you have to kind of know the major types of personality disorders. Now, from cluster A, paranoid personality disorder is simply a distrust of other people. They believe people are out to get them. The difference between this is it should not be confused with paranoid schizophrenia, because paranoid personality disorder does not display hallucinations, delusions, or psychotic symptoms. They are simply, obviously they are very paranoid. They believe everyone's out to get them, but they do not hallucinate or they do not have any other types of psychotic thoughts. They can still stay in terms of sanity, they still have that. Now, schizoid is no social relationship, difficulty displaying feelings for other people. This is the person that lives all alone, probably more or less in an isolated area. These are people that are not going to live in a subdivision. They're not going to even live in a town. These are people that are probably going to be in the middle of the woods somewhere. Okay? Now, schizotypal is a little bit different than schizoid. They have problems either starting or maintaining relationships, but they're often a little bit different because they're odd. These people are just simply, they live alone. They stay by themselves. They're very isolated. Okay? They kind of run from people. These people run from them. All right? It's probably the better way to say it, because they're very odd in the way that they act. Now, cluster B, which is dramatic erratic, histrionic personality disorder, is very obsessed with being the center of attention, very dramatic. Now, emotionally shallow person, high probability of developing a somatoform disorder. Now, histrionic is, I don't like to kind of use this, but it's kind of your drama queen. This is the person that's very much will want to be the center of every conversation, and if they don't get that, they'll act out in a way that will demoralize everybody else. When I say emotionally shallow, they don't care who they hurt. They don't care who they step on, as long as they get what they want. Now, narcissistic, this is the one probably people are most familiar with. They have the belief that they're very important and that they have achieved much success. The problem is they've achieved no success, but they have this belief they have. The difference between narcissistic and someone that's arrogant is arrogant often comes from a result. In other words, somebody who's arrogant has won something, and they let everybody know. Narcissistic can finish last, but in their mind, they finished first. That's why it's a disorder. All right, they don't understand that they came in last place. An arrogant person knows they were in last. Okay, know that they didn't win, and they'll probably be quiet. Narcissistic just don't understand that. Now, borderline personality is instability of emotions, impulse control, excessive fear of being alone, difficulty maintaining relationships and routines. Borderline is their emotions are always on the borderline. They snap a lot of times in different directions. Often, people can tell if you're becoming in a bad mood. You start to transition into it. Borderline is like this. They go from good to bad, from happy to sad, from neurotic to exotic, within just simply the snap of a finger. Now, antisocial personality is the most studied personality disorder. Why? Because it's considered the most harmful, okay, to society. Antisocial personality disorder is your serial killer, your psychopath, your sociopath. They have no feelings of regard for other people. They have a lack of conscience or remorse. They are not, simply sad if they, cause harm to somebody else. Now, in terms of a little bit more detail on antisocial personality disorder, there's no single gene responsible for antisocial personality disorder, but other family members may have been diagnosed. In other words, it runs in the family more of their behavior. Now, the possible link: boys who were highly aggressive, do not respond to punishment, or were classified as conduct disorder in childhood. In other words, the troublemaker. There could be a correlation. But again, correlation is just possible relationship. It doesn't mean direct cause and effect. Now, research has shown a lack of activity in the frontal lobe, which is in charge of planning and thinking, which could explain the impulsive behavior of antisocial personality disorder. Now, again, there is some evidence to show, that they also have damage to their amygdala, which their amygdala is in charge of their emotional control. Now, there also could be attachment problems. In other words, to kind of summarize that screen, they have not really found too much rhyme or reason among the infamous serial killers that are out there. They all seem to come from different backgrounds, exhibit different types of brain activity. So that's why it's very hard to know who is going to be a serial killer or a sociopath. There's not enough common warning signs. Now, the last cluster is the anxious-fearful. Dependent is enormous need to be taken care of, cannot make decisions, rely on others. Now, often this could be classified in a movie like a stage 5 clinger. All right, these people cannot simply operate without somebody telling them what to do. And when they're dependent, often what will happen is, typically, if you befriended a dependent personality disorder, they could call you 40, 50, 60 times in a day. Okay, and that's why there's a little bit more difference than somebody who's just, infatuated with you. Now, obsessive compulsive, again, this is not the same thing as OCD. This is more their personality. It's lifelong. OCD tends to come on at particular times of a person's life. That's when it's a disorder. This is a personality disorder. Now, avoidant is they're oversensitive to criticism, humiliation, or rejection. They don't partake in social situations. This is the person you can't talk into trying to try new things, because they will meet you with 10, 15, 20 reasons why they will fail. They are very sensitive to rejection, and their only way of controlling it is not to simply involve themselves in anything where there will be any. Now, some typical questions. Which personality disorder is characterized by an excessive need to be taken care of? Now again, if you see these questions on a test, most of you are not going to memorize every personality disorder. But what it comes down to is which one are they describing? Well, need to be taken care of, that means they're dependent, so that'd be dependent personality disorder. Now, the last area we have to go over is psychological disorders tied with childhood. externalizing disorders affect people in child's environment and are linked to conduct disorders. Externalizing means outside events. So they tend to get always in trouble. That's a conduct disorder. They don't show a lot of attention in terms of ADHD. Now, internalizing disorders cause children to experience depression and anxiety and isolate themselves. Separation anxiety is fear of being lost. Now, if you remember insecure attachment versus secure attachment, this would obviously be the insecure attachment. Okay? Now, psychological disorders also associated with childhood, and we've talked about these, so I'm just going to kind of skip through them. Autistic children tend to have problems with attachments, okay? Communicating, suffer severe cognitive impairment. Asperger's is a less severe form of autism. They, again, experience problems in social relationships, but they tend to engage in repetitive behaviors such as counting or memorizing figures, okay? Now, one thing I do want to point out, and you could see this on a question, autistic children tend to experience problems with what's something called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are responsible for observation and perception of others. When you are looking at somebody, mirror neurons are being activated. Somebody that has autism may have a lack of, okay, a lack of mirror neurons. In other words, they don't function properly. Okay, and that's it for this chapter.